Were trial chambers a success or a failure? This dungeon has been in the game for a little bit now, so it's time to ask some questions about this edition. What did it do well? What could have been better? And now that it's here, is the game better for it? Hello, I'm Simply Sark. Subscribe if you like what you see. And today, let's decide, were trial chambers a good addition? Alright, so let's talk about copper. And the first question is copper a failed ore? Now, I love copper, it's such a nice building block and there's nothing wrong with the block itself. But ever since trial chambers were added, because they use a lot of copper blocks, it really does pose this question of whether copper as an ore has succeeded or not. A lot of players see ores as blocks that inherently are supposed to have some kind of extra functional use. The big problem with copper now is if you want to use it as a building block, it really makes so much more sense to just find a trial chamber and harvest the blocks directly from the trial chamber. Every time you walk past a copper ore block now, there is this question in your head of if it's even worth digging up. Overall, maybe a good block, but maybe a bad ore. Alright, so let's talk about the vault. Now, I think a lot of people felt that vaults were maybe like a little bit underwhelming, maybe like slightly boring at first because we had all this hype around the keys and stuff. And then what it is really is just like a glorified chest. But what I would say is that this mechanic is such a necessary mechanic and it kind of needs to be addressed at some point. So why not now? And it's a great mechanic because raiding a structure and it's already been, looted and there's nothing is a big problem in multiplayer. So it needed looking at some point. I think where they made a little bit of a misstep here though, is this whole trial chamber system. I thought it was like a little bit different than what we've seen before because it was kind of all about replayability, playing with your friends, etc. And it kind of promotes coming back to a trial chamber and doing it again and again and again. So the fact that a player can only use these vaults once kind of goes against the spirit of this whole structure itself. There are so many instances of having to go find and explore in Minecraft that it would have been nice just once, or just in this small instance, to have a self-contained environment where it's not about exploring and having to find something new constantly. It's about staying in the same location, playing it again and again and again. So with the vault in particular, I think what would have been really cool to see is instead of the vaults just like locking and never being used again, it would have been cool if maybe the loot degraded over time. So instead of having to go find another trial chamber, each time you unlock a vault, the loot pool degrades again and again. So maybe you can use them like, 10 to 20 times until eventually the loot becomes so terrible that you have to go find one. I don't know, I just figured that the trial chambers were, this hub of activity where you would hang out with your friends and replay again and again, which kind of we do see with the spawners, but then we've got the vaults which kind of disagree. So there's kind of a bit of a conflict there. So I'm still kind of curious why we need so many keys. You get these keys from the spawners and you can basically just get, unlimited amounts of them. But the weird thing is that as I mentioned with the vaults, you are kind of like both expected to replay these dungeons again and again, but also kind of not supposed to. You're supposed to just seek out new ones. So it's kind of odd that we're actually given so many of these because it's like, why do we actually need just this unlimited supply of keys when you're not actually expected to stay in the dungeon for long? You're supposed to go find a new one, so you wouldn't need the keys because that dungeon will have new keys. It's kind of treating it a little bit like this resource you're going to need again and again and again. But again, the vaults tell a different story. They set up this expectation that you're going to need loads and loads of keys, but then they say, no, you're actually only using this one time. So it's a little bit confusing and it makes me feel like maybe there were some decisions that were changed in development. Okay, so I'm going to say it. Breeze and Wind Charge are a really, really cool addition to the game. I really love the idea of this mob that isn't specifically like something you're supposed to fight directly, but more as like this agent of chaos that manipulates the battlefield. The Wind Charge, in my opinion, on par with Ender Pearls because it's the first mobility item that we've gotten in so long, and it really does change the dynamic of movement. At first, I didn't really understand the design of the trial chambers, why there was a lot of like verticality, and I was like, how are you going to get up here? But once you actually introduce the idea of wind charge and stuff, it makes total sense, and it makes the whole thing way, way better. And I really start to appreciate how they've actually gone about designing the entire structure itself. What I think would have been kind of cooler though, is these copper grates. I thought these were going to have like a slightly different role, because I thought they were transparent on purpose, purpose. So I thought what was going to happen was we would fire these wind charges and they'd actually go through them because they're made of like air. And I thought this would have been a really interesting dynamic because with the breeze, you know, they could maybe shoot you through these to impact areas that you're hidden behind the grates. And I think it just would have added more to that chaotic element that they were going for. So it's a little bit of a shame that the copper grates didn't see a little bit more attention in that regard. So I'm going to be totally honest, when armor trims were first added, I didn't really care for them too much because in my opinion, they kind of create some style issues. But what I will say is I actually do think they are proving, along with the banner patterns and maybe even the pottery sherds actually, quite a good solution to the loot problem. Minecraft has an ongoing loot problem where they're really not sure how to occupy chests and how to reward players. And again in these structures, we've been encountering this thing where a lot of people feel that their rewards are underwhelming. But these templates are actually quite a good solution to this because it creates this element of exclusivity and you can occupy chests, you can occupy structures with literal unique rewards. I think that the ominous system is really cool and I'm really happy to see that they actually separate these and are going to expand this whole mechanic into what I'm kind of seeing as like a bit of like a hard mode, like optional hard mode. But to be totally honest, the thing I'm actually most excited is outside of the trial chambers. I'm really interested to see how they're actually going to use this system in other places because I'm imagining places like, you know, an ominous nether fortress, an ominous ancient city, an ominous stronghold. And it's a really cool mechanic because it kind of lets them give a second life to structures, scenarios and places where you get this kind of more difficult, more crazy version of something you've already done. And I think that's really clever. Obviously, it still remains to be seen if any of that will be implemented and what their plans are for it. But I definitely think it's piqued a lot of people's interest. Is the mace all that useful? Honestly, probably not really. I'm kind of neutral. I'm kind of indifferent about the mace. It's very much like a fashion item. I don't think it really impacts the game all that much, but I'm fine it existing because it's very much just like a novelty item that people are getting just for the sake of getting it. But I do agree with a lot of people where I do think that the item texture maybe could have been a little bit more flashy. If this is a fashion item, if this is an item that you're kind of just holding to, you know, just sort of impress people, I do think you should notice it more and you should really say, hey, you know, that guy has a mace, wow, rather than it's like, oh, he's got a mace. I am actually really happy to see that they've invested a whole update with a feature that is multiplayer first and kind of single player second. We don't see this too often, but multiplayer is a big part of the game. And actually having this like dedicated structure, which was designed with like multiple people in mind, kind of stands out from what we've expected so far, but like in a good way. I will say though, how the copper golem does not exist in the game after they added this structure, I will never know. So are trial chambers a success or not? In my opinion, I think this dungeon is a really good example of great dungeon design. There are definitely some flaws here and there, but what I will say is all of them are minimal and they're also really fixable. I don't think there's anything foundationally wrong with the trial chambers that couldn't be solved with tweaks rather than, you know, complete overhauls. Hey, maybe the loot is a bit bad at the moment, but you know, that's great because loot is one of the easiest things to fix. Vaults do have some flaws, but again, this is something that can be fixed with tweaks. It's not something that's broken at its core. I think this dungeon is a really great addition to the game. And while there may be some teething issues, I think as we go into the future and as we look back in time, I think people are going to see this dungeon as a really great standout example of how to design structures that consider all player types and play styles. But let me know what your opinion is on all of this. Either way, that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, guys. As always, I have been Simply Sark, and I will catch you in the next one.